part of why I'm so alarmed is various central bankers around the world are saying things like, well, maybe we should go to a basket of currencies, or maybe we should start putting gold in the mix, or maybe the IMF should have special drawing rights, and we'll start using that as the reserve currency. And people didn't talk like that even a year ago. Right? This is very new language, and I think they're sort of laying, they're testing the waters and trying to get people used to the idea so that if and when it does happen, there's not this massive panic. I think they're trying to butter people up or soften them up. So I don't have a great solution for you, except that I think that they should, if possible, discreetly maybe start reducing their reserves, or at least not add to them. So that's what a lot of things other countries are doing too, is they're not adding to the reserves, they're starting to add other things.
Jordan?
Yeah, Jordan.
Another related problem is that the new parity will mean that Bahamas will become more expensive regarding the US, and therefore tourism will suffer. But that's one of the points. The other question I wanted to ask you is, well, what's your prediction of the next bubble then? Because if the policy of the Fed is as you suggest and continues, there's going to be a next bubble.
Right, so the question is, well, he made 2 points. One was, no matter what, you're going to have a drop in U.S. tourism, because even if you de-link from the dollar, the U.S. dollar, U.S. tourists are going to be poorer when they come here if the exchange rate goes to 2-to-1. And so you're either way, if the U.S. is bad economically and we're poorer, we can't trade with you as much. You're not going to get, so there's no way getting around that. And his other point was, what's the next bubble? I think there's a bubble right now in U.S. Treasury debt. That I think U.S. bond prices are far above what they should be. It's sort of perverse, and part of this is I'm trying to justify my mistake. In July of 2007, I had an analysis I did for a bank, and I predicted that this was going to be the worst recession in 25 years, and at the time when some people weren't even sure if we were in recession. So right now that seems obvious, but back then it wasn't so obvious. That was a pretty good call. But I also said there's going to be, the dollar's going to depreciate. And I was wrong. The dollar has appreciated since then because of this. It's this perverse thing. Because of the financial panic, people are rushing into U.S. Treasuries as the safest thing. And so it's ironic that at the same time, when the U.S. is borrowing record amounts, the Fed's printing dollars like crazy, the dollar is strengthening. And so I think that's just a temporary thing. The analogy I use, I don't know if you guys get the cartoon down here, but the Roadrunner cartoon, does anyone know it? And when the villain, the Wile E. Coyote, when he runs off the cliff, and he runs off, and until he looks down, he doesn't fall. But once he looks down, he starts falling. And I kind of think that's the situation investors are in with respect to the U.S. economy. Is everyone kind of knows this is crazy. Look at what the Federal Reserve has done, but since nothing's happened so far, I guess it's okay, and no one wants to be the one to pull the trigger. But I think it's unsustainable.
Sorry, given cap and trade, may alternative energies be also a candidate for bubble?
So the question is, alternative energies, are they in a bubble? I think they are, because various government policies are propping up, wind power, solar power, things like that. They're getting all sorts of subsidies. So yeah, I do think that once things really get bleak and the government eventually has to cut back its funding on various things, I think some of those you're going to see will collapse. Yeah.
There's so many different points you drew our attention to very nicely. It's a bit difficult to know how to focus on some of them. We talked about the possible devaluation of the US currency, yet only this week you got 4 of the major emerging countries, BRIC group, they said they were going to support US Treasury, or because they've got so much US Treasuries, they're going to maintain that. In another segment, you were saying that people, and particularly in America, are now probably being more encouraged to save. But if they're going to save, where do they put their savings? They're not going to go out and buy consumer stuff, you hope not. But you're not going to put it in a bank with a lousy interest rate. So what are you going to do? How are you going to encourage people to save?
Okay, so the question's a good one. What does the average person do to save, if that's the response? So here, let me give the disclaimer. I'm not an official investment advisor, so don't sue me if this blows up in your face. But what I'm doing myself, I tell my parents to do this and others, is one thing is I have a small portion of actual gold and silver coins. So for me in the United States, I have quarters and dimes that were issued before 1962, I think. they actually have silver content. And so the reason I like those is because other Americans will recognize it. I can say, look, it's a quarter, and go Google it and see that since it's from 1955, it actually has this much silver. So that's a bit, you know, I don't want to be giving them some, you know, gold bar that they can take my word for how much it weighs, or saying I can go to the grocery store with a gold bar. So that's what I have just as an absolute. I don't have this yet, but my idea is I'm a consultant, and so the idea is what happens when severe inflation hits. If it were just a one-shot thing, you know, so let's assume for the moment it's not just going to keep getting worse and worse until the dollar collapses. But if it's just a few years of, let's say, 20% inflation, you know, the idea is eventually your wages and salaries will rise until you reach the new equilibrium. And so it's just that intermediate period where you're still getting the same paycheck, but the price of milk is rising by 20% a year. That's where you need help. And so if you had a stockpile of precious metals that will zoom up in price, presumably, then you can unload those to sort of get you over the hump. But longer term, I think what you want is things that will yield you an income that will rise with the inflation. So like if you had, for example, I tell people in the United States, if you have low-income apartment units, that you know, presumably even in a bad recession, people still need to live somewhere. So if you have really cheap apartment units that you can rent out, and then as prices rise, you can raise your rents. Of course, the problem is maybe the Obama administration is going to put on rent control. You know? So again, it's hard to know what to do, but the idea is to try to spread to get things that will yield you income that's not a fixed money amount, that will rise hopefully with prices. Because again, you know, the stock market's risky, since I think all the stuff they're doing is going to wreck the economy. So I don't know if I want to own stocks. Jeremy?
Sorry, Michael, I understand that your expertise comes from a U.S. perspective. Can you comment a bit just upon what, say, the UK and the EU, they've been doing very similar things as far as vis-a-vis bailing out the banks. Obviously, they can't print debt the way the U.S. Treasury can. But by the same token, I see that they're somewhat in the same mode. And I just know a lot of people are looking towards emerging markets and other places than the developed world is places to invest.
Right, so the question is, you know, what's the status of the UK and Eurozone? I think the UK, again, and I'm not nearly as well informed about them as the United States, I think my general view is that the European Central Bank has actually been fairly, I mean, what they've been doing, they've been inflating, but it's nothing compared to what the Federal Reserve has done. And so I think the euro should do well against the dollar, you know, relatively speaking. I mean, they both will probably depreciate against gold and silver. In Great Britain, my understanding is that they're really on the edge, and they've bailed out their banking system so much, and that they're just, like, the British government is, it doesn't have the resources. It can't, you know, their banks have so much debt and insolvency that they can't bail them out anymore, in other words. Whereas the U.S., they still have the resources. It's just foolish. I think in Britain, they're actually at the point where they hit a wall. So I think Britain's finances are pretty awful, whereas the European Central Bank has been a lot more responsible.
There's probably, well, there's also perhaps some more ships that fall in Eastern Europe as well.
Right, and also, I don't know how much this translates into the actual policies, but I mean, the German chancellors have been having great, you know, I've been on my blog, I've been quoting her, and there's good stuff about her telling the U.S., you guys are nuts. I was like, yes, that's what I've been saying for 2 years.
Yeah, the U.S. government's been buying up just so much of the U.S. economy. I mean, they've been doing banking, automobile. What's next for them to buy up? I mean, are they gonna, I mean, is that it? Is that the extent of them? Or? Well,
like I said, I mean, their next thing is healthcare. Right now they're doing healthcare. And then later they postponed it, but now they have cap and trade, in which they're literally going to take over the energy sector. So I mean, and I'm sure they can take on something else too. And once investors start taking their money and putting it somewhere else, maybe the computer industry, maybe they'll bring another antitrust suit against Microsoft or something.
There's no foreseeable end to what this new administration is going to buy up, basically, or?
I'm hoping at some point fortunately, I don't want to leave people completely dazed here. I mean, I think most Americans are starting to come to their senses, and they're like, wait a minute, you just spent how many trillions of dollars? That, you know, it started, because what happened is those numbers got so big so quickly that we got desensitized. Just to give you an idea, George Bush, this happened, what was it, like March or April of